I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest news from the battlefront as Ukraine launches a massive attack on a Russian airbase, while reports come in that Russian troops have reached the suburbs of Chasiv Yar. We also speak to Andrea Yanuta, reporter at the Kyiv Independent, about the problems in the Ukrainian Parliament as the government struggles to gather necessary votes during parliamentary sessions.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Friday the 5th of April, 2 years and 41 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley, and our guest is Andrea Yanuta. I started by summarising the latest updates from Ukraine. Well, there's big news out of Russia this morning. 6 warplanes were destroyed and 8 others suffered damage in a massive Ukrainian drone attack on a Russian military airfield in Rostov. This is located around 100 miles from the Ukrainian border, and this info is of course coming from the Ukrainians. An intelligence source speaking to the Reuters news agency said the attack was a joint operation conducted by the SBU security service and the military. Vasily Golubev, the Russian regional governor, said on Telegram that Russian air defense intercepted more than 40 drones targeting the airfield. But footage of the incident posted on social media showed several explosions rocking the airfield, with anti-aircraft fire erupting into the night sky. A Ukrainian security source said this morning's large-scale drone attack on the airfield will, quote, significantly reduce the combat potential of the Russians. Just some detail for us. The Morozovsk airbase is usually home to Moscow's 559th Guards Bomber Regiment, which used its fleet of Su-24s and Su-34s to strike targets in Ukraine multiple times over the past 2 years. Satellite imagery from Thursday, so yesterday, which was analysed by open-source researchers, appeared to show at least 30 Russian fighter jets and bombers stationed at the base shortly before the Ukrainian attack. And locals claimed to have witnessed at least 60 explosions, so different figures to what the Russian authorities are saying, in the early morning raid. This large-scale attack, of course, forms part of a series of drone strikes on Russia. Moscow's defense ministry claimed it downed 53 Ukrainian drones across 5 regions in total overnight. Moving into Ukraine then and looking at the front lines, Russia's state-owned RIA news agency is reporting that Russian forces have advanced into a suburb of the city of Chasiv Yar in Ukraine's Donetsk region. Located around 6 miles west of Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar has served as an important staging point for Ukrainian troops in the area and is heavily fortified. This news comes after Russia carried out a mechanised assault on the city yesterday, advancing up to its eastern outskirts. That came from the Institute for the Study of War. However, and this is important, Ukraine has denied these claims, specifically the claims that Russia has entered the suburbs of the city. The spokesman for Ukraine's Eastern Command said, "The situation there is very difficult. The fighting continues, but they, the Russian troops, are not there." So it's definitely a fluid situation and one we will keep a close eye on. Maybe on Monday we'll have more data and more news we can bring you. Just to add to that, this came in a couple of minutes ago. The head of the city's military administration, that's Chasiv Yar, has reported that the city is under, quote, constant fire from Russian forces. Sergei Chaus said, "If before there were moments where you could hear silence in the city, now there is no silence, there is constant fire." Zooming out, across Ukraine, the Air Force reported that it shot down all 13 Shahid drones launched in an overnight attack on the southern regions. Drones were destroyed over Zaporizhzhia, Odessa and Dnipropetrovsk. The Air Force added that missiles were also launched in the attacks. One of the strikes targeted energy infrastructure in the Odessa region. Debris damaged homes and farms. Elsewhere in Kharkiv, an explosion late yesterday damaged cars and a 5-story building. That came from Olesny Hubuhov, the regional governor, and no casualties were reported. Tragically, there were still deaths across Ukraine, regional authorities saying that at least 3 people were killed and 11 injured in strikes over the past day. Just some of the details there. An airstrike on the village of New York in Donetsk killed 2 people and injured 2 others. That comes from Vadim Fileshkin, the regional governor, who added that 37 homes were damaged in the attack. A further person was killed in Kramatorsk as Russia targeted 10 regions in total. Away from the front lines and going to Europe, Czechia's transport minister has said that Moscow has made, quote, thousands, end quote, of attempts to disrupt European train networks in a bid to derail the EU and cripple critical infrastructure. Martin Kupka told the Financial Times that Russia has made, quote, thousands of attempts to weaken our systems since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Some of the detail, the cyber campaign targeted the signalling systems of Czechia's national rail operator, with previous attacks putting ticketing systems out of service. Concerns have also been raised about the potential for Russian interference with train signals to cause serious accidents. Just one final quote from Mr. Kupka, who said, "It's definitely a difficult point, but I'm really very satisfied because we are able to defend all systems before a successful attack." And I know that Francis will shortly be talking about other accusations of potential Russian interference in other areas of Europe. But finally, from me, an interesting snippet on the near future of the war. An unnamed NATO official has said that Russia is unlikely to launch a large-scale offensive in the near future, while Russian forces still have, quote, significant quantitative advantage, end quote, in terms of weapons and personnel. They, as he said, still lack the ammunition and manoeuvrable units required for a successful major offensive. This official was talking to European Pravda. He added that Russian units on the front line are understaffed and inexperienced and receive politically motivated orders to achieve unrealistic goals. I mean, this, zooming out slightly, we've seen several large-scale Russian mechanized assaults fail quite spectacularly across the front lines in the past week. This might be what he's talking about and referencing there. Finally, Moscow is unlikely to be able to conduct any significant offensive without further large-scale mobilization, he said. So these comments come, of course, after Volodymyr Zelensky said in February that Russia is preparing to launch an offensive in the spring or the start of the summer, and that's also something I've heard from Ukrainian military commanders. The Institute for the Study of War, just to add a coda on this, has said that the Russian offensive focus may look at the western part of Donetsk near Avdiivka, which of course was captured from Ukraine in February. Well, those are all the frontline updates. Francis Dearnley, what's on your desk?
Thanks, David. I'm going to begin with an extraordinary story that broke after our broadcast yesterday when I referenced a rare rapprochement between Moscow and Paris as the latter prepares for the Olympics in July. The intention of that call was to ensure a line of communication was open to share intelligence about possible terrorist activity following the Moscow concert hall attack last month. Tellingly, that call seems to have become quite symbolic of the general state of French-Russian relations at present, with President Macron going public yesterday to denounce what he called the bizarre and threatening tone of Russia's defense minister, who suggested that Paris may have somehow been involved in the Moscow concert hall attack. As a consequence, Macron is now saying that Russia may target France during the Games in the hope of disrupting the event. "I have no doubt they will do this," he said, including in the informational space. "Russia feeds every day into the idea that we shouldn't do this or that, and that's why we must stand firm. Strength of character, self-confidence, and the relationship with the truth are the great strengths of democracies and great nations." I would certainly agree with him on the relationship with the truth, but I think political theorists might have something to say about the self-confidence point being an innate advantage of democracies. Usually it's actually autocracies that wield strength certainly in the shorter term, but longer term, perhaps the others do come into play. But that's enough Machiavellian de Tocqueville for now. The real significance of this story is that it can be read as symbolic of the widening gulf in the mentality between Russia and the West. The West is still arguably operating under the old order to a degree, whereas there is increasing evidence that Russia is not. It seems to be reverting to the feverish dogmatism of its past, whether under the Tsars or the Bolsheviks. Steve Rosenberg of the BBC did an interesting summary of today's newspapers in Russia, with many articles making references to Russia's civilizational role on the world stage and denouncing the West as becoming unchristian, even quoting some religious figures as talking about the Antichrist. There'll be more on that in a minute or two. But just as an example of history repeating itself, and I think the direction of travel, if we're not there already, I remember when the Queen died, rifling through the Telegraph archive of previous royal funerals. Our paper has been being published since 1855, so there were a fair few of them, as you can imagine. And there was huge anxiety at the funeral of Elizabeth II's father, George VI, that the broadcasts of the funeral around the empire would be jammed by the Soviets. We're back there in a lot of ways. So many countries, and I'm about to list them now, are talking about Russian interference openly, publicly, in a way that speaks to the shift in Russian mentality, or at least, perhaps more accurately, an appreciation of what Russia has been doing and vocalising that at last. So back to today, as you mentioned, David, Czechia's hawkish President Pavel, affectionately nicknamed by some Czech Norris for his efforts to arm Ukraine, is also warning of Europe-wide disruption at the hands of the Russians, with his transport minister saying that thousands of attempts have been made to interfere with rail networks, trying to destabilise EU critical infrastructure. Finland, too, has said that following Russia's weaponising of migration, it will indefinitely extend the closure of its land border crossing with Russia. So they say Finnish authorities see this as a long-term solution now. We've not seen anything this spring that would lead us to conclude that the situation has changed meaningfully. Listeners will recall Finland shut its land borders with Russia late last year amid a growing number of arrivals from countries including Syria and Somalia, seemingly pushed into Finland deliberately by Russia in order to sow discord in the country. Now, Finland is the 8th country with which Ukraine has now signed a security agreement after the Finnish PM met with President Zelensky yesterday. Said the latter on that, we have a comprehensive systemic document that enshrines cooperation between Ukraine and Finland for 10 years in all areas of fundamental importance. Defence and financial assistance, investments, cooperation for Ukraine's recovery, support for our accession to EU and NATO, and sanctions against Russia. It is vital to make Putin see that the world is not afraid, stays united, and defends life collectively. Welcome news for Kyiv, of course, but big questions remain as to whether these security agreements would be enough, even with so many of them being signed, to deter a future Russian invasion after this war ends. That remains to be seen, but it is, of course, a critical question and one we've discussed on the podcast previously. Further evidence, too, of Russian interference in Georgia, with European Union officials criticising the country for resurrecting a Russia-backed bill to crack down on foreign agents. So the EU has granted Georgia candidate membership status, but has said that the progress would only be subject to further reforms, and said that it therefore regrets the decision for Georgia to reintroduce this bill. So the bill, for a bit of context, was abandoned amid protests last year and is supported by the Kremlin, requiring organisations receiving more than 20% of their funding from overseas to register as, quote, pursuing the interests of a foreign power. Labelled the Russian law, it closely mirrors legislation in Moscow used to crack down on dissent, and is being viewed now as symptomatic of deepening ties between Tbilisi and the Kremlin following the outbreak of the war. Peskov, tellingly, Kremlin spokesman, of course, said that Russia wants stability and predictability in Georgia and defended this proposed law as a result, stating, "No state wants interference from other countries in domestic politics. This is normal practice." You really couldn't make it up. Now, just on this, Moscow is also stoking tensions in the Balkans, and all news from there at present makes grim reading indeed. It's a complex situation, so if you're interested in that subject, I recommend reading friend of the podcast, Dr. Ivana Stradna's piece for the Telegraph that I published yesterday called "The West Cannot Let Putin Open a Second Front in Europe." It highlights how the region, oft neglected, is a ripe prospect for Russia's aspirations and is becoming increasingly febrile and dangerous. And we'll add a link to the show notes for that. And just lastly for this section, David, more embarrassment for Germany after a torrid few weeks for them. At least 2 German companies are reportedly involved in Russia's reconstruction of Mariupol, a project that the Kremlin is using, of course, to solidify its claims to that illegally annexed territory. Knowles, a Bavarian cement maker, and WKB Systems, a concrete producer from the Rhine region, have both delivered material to construction firms working in the city, according to the German broadcaster ARD. The broadcaster found photographic evidence that cement stacks bearing the logo of the former were stacked up at building sites in the city, which Russia occupied after that long and terrible siege in 2022. The head of the firm was an honorary consul for Russia for several years and has been pictured with Putin. The broadcaster also published photographs of concrete blocks wrapped in plastic bearing the logo of WKB Systems, that German firm that belongs to Viktor Bulgarin, a Russian oligarch. Customs data shows that the company supplied the components to construct entire production facilities to Russia over a period of years. Now, according to the campaign group Business for Ukraine, B for Ukraine, just 8 of the 248 German companies that had subsidiaries in Russia at the start of the war have cut ties with the country. They say for every $4 in aid that Germany pledges to Ukraine, German companies pay $1 in taxes to Russia. It's yet another example of the gulf between strong words on sanctions and the actual activity that is going on in Russia by European nations that is effectively funding the war effort.
Well, thank you so much, Francis. That's an awful lot to get through, so thanks for breaking it down for us. Just one question from me. You mentioned the evolving Russian mentality in your answer there. I know there's a piece you want to draw attention to today which speaks to this. Can you tell us about what you've been reading?
Sure, David. Well, it's specifically a piece by Dmitry Trenin on RT, so published by what was, of course, formerly known as Russia Today. Hold your horses, I know the source, but I flag this because the fact RT is publishing this tells you a lot about the mentality that they want to be encouraging amongst Russian elites. Trenin is a research professor at the Higher School of Economics and a member of the Russian International Affairs Council. And he argues in the piece that Russia is undergoing a new invisible revolution. As he writes, and I quote, "Instead of surrendering to a post-Cold War setup in which it was left with no say, Russia has begun pushing back more and more against the hegemonic US-centered system. For the first time since the Bolsheviks, albeit in a very different way from then, the country has de facto become a revolutionary power. Now Moscow has to admit that even the UN, including its Security Council, which Russia, a veto-wielding permanent member, has traditionally hailed as the centrepiece of the world system, has turned into a dysfunctional theatre of polemics. From Russia's standpoint, not only can't the West be trusted any longer, the international bodies that it controls have lost all legitimacy." He goes on. Following the presidential election, Putin can proceed now with even deeper changes and must make sure that those he has already wrought are preserved and built upon by those who succeed him. It is important to note that the Russian elites, which since the 1990s have been closely tied to the West, have had to make a hard choice recently between their country and their assets. Those who decided to stay have become more national in their outlook and action. Meanwhile, Putin has launched a campaign to form a new elite around the Ukraine war veterans. The expected turnover of Russian elites and the transformation from a cosmopolitan group of self-serving individuals into a more traditional coterie of privileged servants of the state and its leader would make sure that the foreign policy revolution is complete. In short, then, as others have noted, this piece discusses a total severance from the current world economic and political apparatus and the dramatic shift to inward investment and reorientation to non-Western countries. The piece too makes reference to this idea of Russia as a distinct civilization. Yet I have to wonder what China and other nations would make of an article like this. Only today, Russia is championing the proposed Chinese peace plan for the war. Would Beijing agree with this idea of total severance from Western political systems and economies? It would go against their prevailing orthodoxy in so many realms. This is the danger from President Xi's point of view, that he has a partner in Russia who has effectively declared war on their, for now at least, economic allies. They won't necessarily like this direction of travel. even if it means a pivot in their direction, as it contaminates them by association. It bears repeating what exactly Russia can export to the world in civilizational terms. A successful model for dictatorship, perhaps. I think that wouldn't be a stretch, actually, given the way that Putin has been allowed to remain in office effectively and has projected strength. Knowledge, too, of certain weapons systems. Certainly North Korea would agree with that. But still, I would posit that the Soviet Union was a much graver threat intellectually from a Western perspective, as it was far less nationalist and more internationalist as an ideology. It's ironic, really, that Russia has reverted to its old, more inward-looking model of strength, rooted more in the 19th century, and in so doing has actually made itself less relevant philosophically and intellectually than it was in the 20th century, and certainly in the 21st. Now, similarly, this article is constantly blaming the West for everything, as one would expect. But there's a paradox here I was thinking about. How can one be both fulfilling one's civilizational destiny, something supposedly rooted in strength, whilst at the same time saying that one is being forced to adopt that position by the evil West, which by logic suggests a sort of inner weakness? Make up your mind. You can't really hold both positions at once. So it's a revealing piece in many ways, David, and thoughts welcome from listeners as ever. And just on that theme, I know that you're doing Defence in Depth next week, our video series, which is often chaired by Dom. I've done a couple in the last few weeks. I know you're thinking of a possible subject for that, and we haven't planned this, but I'm wondering whether you want to talk about that, because we were having an interesting conversation about it earlier, and I think listeners will welcome hearing your reflections, and I'm sure they'd have some insights too to offer.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Francis. When this invitation to do the video comes along, usually I can't. I'm too busy, planning this and doing this. And they've finally managed to pin me down. Dom's off. Nobody else can do it. So I thought, right, okay, good. Here's my time. I think I've also sort of resisted doing this for a while because I hadn't had a good idea for what we could talk about and what we could do in depth. I think we've got one. What I'd quite like to talk about is the developments the positive developments for the Russians anyway, of their military. What have they been doing quite well? And to what extent is the meme that you sort of saw going around in 2022, even into 2023, of the Russians essentially being meat grinder troops, badly trained with little tactical or strategic sense, how much of that is still true? And it's a very complicated and nuanced subject, I think, because I think if you really want to understand, if Western partners and friends want to understand how to help Ukraine, they need to recognise and be honest about their opponent's strengths. And as I said, it's difficult, right? As I mentioned earlier in my updates, just this last week, we've seen two catastrophic mechanised Russian assaults that have run straight into well-prepared, well-supplied Ukrainian defences and been blown off the table. That said, there are some advantages we do need to talk about. We need to think about why they're there. And I think the point with all of these things is none of these are silver bullets that's going to win the war for Russia, but they are things that are then compounded in a positive direction for the Russians by things like regular artillery ammunition supply from their friends who are turning out to be a lot more reliable than Ukraine's Western allies. So my shortlist, Francis, and I'd be interested to hear what you think of it and whether you'd add or take away anything. I mean, I've scribbled down the things I want to look at would be, for example, the Lancet drones, the Russian drone program, which is outproducing, we think, the Ukrainians, which is very, very effective and very difficult to battle against. We can also talk about fortifications. I think when you look at the Surovikin line, I was really struck, Francis, by when we were in Washington last year and we spoke to the Institute for the Study of War, and I believe it was Carolina Hurd, I think it was her, I need to check with her, who talked about the sort of the Russian defence of the south and the construction of the Surovikin line, and how Ukrainians hoped they might get 70 kilometres in a couple of days, and they made about 20 in 3-4 months. And she made the point that doctrinally, the Russian defence there had been carried out almost perfectly. The Ukrainians went straight into massed nests of anti-tank guns and units they didn't know existed, and minefields upon minefields upon minefields, and the density of the mines slowed everything down. And the minute they lost some Western kit, everything had to be slowed down, and it failed. And the Russian defence, I don't think, has been properly looked at. I mean, we've seen, I think, both sides in this war find it difficult to go on the offensive. It's much easier to defend in this war, I think, up and down the front. That's what we're seeing at the moment, as I, again, mentioned these failed mechanised assaults from the Russians in the past few weeks. A couple of other things. I mean, I put this out to some friends in Ukraine who know about these kind of things, and they mentioned the Russian ability to imitate Ukrainian tech and then outproduce them with a bigger economy and an economy which is completely war-focused. And also their ability to repurpose outdated gear in a way that tactically gives them an advantage. I'm thinking here about the FAB, the glide bombs that are causing such havoc and misery and destruction in the border regions in Sumy in the last few weeks. So those are a couple of things. I mean, as I said, none of these are silver bullets. They're not that far ahead of the Ukrainians necessarily, but all of these little advantages are compounded by the fact that they've got more ammunition and they've got more men. And I think what we need to do is look at that with open eyes, and we need to acknowledge it and talk about it. And if we can do that, we get a little bit away from the sort of slightly, and I mean, by now I think it's basically incorrect, this idea that most Russian soldiers don't know what they're doing and tanks leave their hatches open and grenades get dropped through, and that's the end of an armada. I mean, of course that's happened. We do see that, but we shouldn't let the stuff that plays well on social media distort the kind of general pattern and what we're hearing. So, Francis, those are my thoughts. As listeners will be able to tell, I'm still fairly early on with this. And of course, if you have a background in this or would like to write in, especially in Ukraine, I'd be very, very interested to hear your take on this and your thoughts. But the attempt here is to try and honestly understand and look at some of the advantages the Russian army might have, and therefore what to do about it. That's what I'm thinking about, Francis. What do you make of it?
I think it's a fascinating subject, David, and I think it's a very good time to be reflecting on this as we think ahead to possible summer offensives from either Ukraine or Russia. Both have mooted the prospect, and so it does feel the right time to be talking about it. You mentioned there this debate, I think it's fair to say, around Russian doctrine, military doctrine. And I think there is a sort of a way of reconciling the view that they are a learning organisation versus not a learning organisation. I mean, I think very bluntly, they clearly have proven themselves a learning organisation over the past 2 years. But that's a long period of time when you're fighting a war. And I think there is a lot of evidence that they are slower on the uptake. And so I think it needn't be they're either one or the other. The fact is that they are a learning organisation, but they are still much, much slower. And that means that when Ukraine has certain advantages, that all of a sudden they are considerably further ahead and will be so for a sustained period. Indeed, that is why I think Zaluzhny, in that essay in The Economist that we talk about so often, was keen to emphasise that he believes that with a technology leap, it is very much possible for us to be seeing Ukraine making the kind of gains that it was in the first year or so of the war. More sceptical people would argue that it needs to be a policy leap instead in the shorter term. But anyway, that's a discussion for another time. I think something else that's very relevant to this, it's just on my mind because I've been talking a little bit about history today. And funnily enough, it was something I covered in a Defence in-Depth video where I was reflecting on Napoleonic military doctrine, is this idea when it comes to learning that whenever an army has a lot of advantages earlier on, and I think that's fair to say that Ukraine did in terms of its structures, its adaptability, its Western weapons, its preparedness, all of these sorts of things, that inevitably over a period of time, the enemy adapts. That was certainly the case, again, to use the Napoleonic example, with Napoleon. He had numerous doctrinal advantages in tactics and weaponry too, to a degree. He was an artillery expert and was able to bring that to bear on the battlefield in ways that had never been seen before. But then, over a prolonged period of warfare, his enemies learned, and by the end, by 1813, by 1815, of course, we knew his strategy. We knew how to break that down. And I think there is increased evidence now that we have seen that happen in the Ukraine-Russia context, hence why there are some people who erroneously call it a stalemate, which suggests nothing is happening. A lot is happening, but they can't break through because both sides have essentially adopted adaptive strategies due to the strategies of the other. So it's a really important subject, I think, and one that is really good to try and break down. But as I say, I think that those people who are framing it as being, well, that anyone who said that the Soviet doctrine was there was wrong is also incorrect. I think it is still there in the Russian model, but it just means that they are slower rather than it being that they can never adapt and evolve, because of course they can. And indeed, we even saw that during the Soviet Union period. So it's just a question of timescales, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, a couple of things to add to that. I'm going to ventriloquise our colleague and friend, senior foreign correspondent Roland Olan. I was talking to him about this and running some ideas past, and he made one point where he said, look, the Russian army of today is not the same army that went into Ukraine in 2022 that catastrophically failed to take the capital and was forced to retreat. It's not the same army that was pushed out of Kharkiv region. It has evolved, it has changed. Of course it has. It does so in a different way than a Western military might, and certainly the Ukrainian military does, but it does do it. At the end of the day, these people don't want to die in a trench. You're going to try and fight, and if your option is either is to be put on court-martial by a unit of blockers behind you, you probably will at some point try and work out how to stay alive and how to win. The other thing I remember Roland saying is that the one advantage is of autocracy is you can make decisions very, very quickly. I mean, we did listeners. This is the interview coming up is going to be with a Kiev Independent reporter talking about some of the problems the Ukrainian Parliament is starting to face in terms of passing legislation and the issues and the sort of how it's starting to drift slightly in focus, and less stuff is being done in the Ukrainian Parliament, partly because it's a democracy, and when people disagree that slows things down. And in an autocracy, often you can just, if something doesn't work, right, fire him and get somebody else in, and if that doesn't work, we'll get the next person in, and then eventually you might get somebody who does know how to do it, and that's a little terrifying. I mean, some of my thinking on this has been, and this is a sort of another teaser for listeners, we'll be publishing an interview next week, and there'll be a print piece with it, which is a long-form interview with a Ukrainian brigade commander, Pavlo Kurylenko, from the Special Presidential Brigade in Kiev, and I had the pleasure to go to speak to him on his base outside the city when we were there last month. And it was a really fascinating, we spoke for ages about, sort of Ukrainian doctrine and Soviet doctrine and NATO doctrine, and how he was seeing how essentially NATO, he made the point that, NATO tactics, NATO strategy assume a lot, like you've got all the kit, you've got all the intelligence. And he said, look, well, we don't have all the kit. We don't have enough men. So we can't do that. We have to do a different thing. And he was trying to find a third way, essentially a Ukrainian way of fighting, which takes the best of what the NATO training offers, but also reconciles that with what the Ukrainian military actually is as it is fighting this war. And it was really fascinating. And he speaks about how fighting the Russians is sometimes like fighting a mirror, that they learn, they follow, they adapt, and suddenly your advantage is gone, and they can outproduce you in that advantage. So some of my thinking is informed by that interview, which we'll be putting out I think on Tuesday, and some of it's just from lots of conversations with people in country, and just some of our own thoughts, Francis, and listening to you and Dom and seeing the news come through. So as I said, this is something I'm starting to think about. So listeners who do know, please feel free to get in touch. The email address is of course in the show notes. Francis, is that everything you wanted to ask me about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think just one other thing I would add, based on what you've said there, is I think you're right that, of course, we're in a situation, and Roland is right too, to think in terms of this as being a new Russian army, in effect, that has had to rebuild itself from the disasters of early in the war. And, of course, that is also something that has major ramifications for Europe's security longer term. If one imagines a situation where this war were to end or even be extended in some fashion, then this army will have learned a lot from its hardship in the past 2 years in Ukraine. So a Russian armed forces that was crippled and could have been crippled and destroyed, I think it's fair to say, within the first year of the war, if there had been really decisive support for the Ukrainians in terms of some of the weapons delivery they asked for that they didn't get until a year later, etc., then we now face, as a consequence, a far graver threat. And that was always the danger, that if you allow a country to get away with essentially going on to a war economy footing without being decisively defeated in a country, then it becomes an even greater danger. And unfortunately, there has still been this mentality of we need to de-escalate, we need to de-escalate, we need to de-escalate. Russia is going to be escalating anyway by the manner that it is fighting a war. And so the only way to stop that is to be robust, history suggests. but we've been adopting the totally wrong approach. And so I would say that anyone who's only looking at this and thinking about this in the context of Ukraine must look bigger. And that is what the Baltic states are doing. And that is what other nations on Russia's border are doing, is that they realise that this new army, if it can be articulated as such, will be a graver danger to them. And as I've said before, again, if you look at history, there is a suggestion that as societies become more militaristic, and I think it's very fair to say that Russia has as a consequence of this war, the pressure internally for conquest becomes greater. You have more men in the army. You have army generals who can rival the political establishment. They're pushing to do more. And so this is something we need to be very, very cautious of in the years ahead, and why it remains, I would argue, of vital importance for Russia to be stopped as soon as possible. Because anyone who thinks the longer this goes on, things will get better, may well be deluding themselves.
Well, it's been a fascinating chat, Francis. We didn't plan any of that, did we? So thank you for asking me those questions. And as I said, please do feel free to get in touch if you have thoughts. I'm still at an early stage of planning this. And it's a very nuanced and sort of tricky subject to speak about, I think. I mean, every single point you make has to be then qualified and qualified again. Francis, do you have any final thoughts for us?
Well, yes, back to that point you were just mentioning, David, about the political situation in Ukraine. In another world, of course, Ukraine would have voted on Sunday. We tend to forget that the democratic process has, of course, been forcibly stalled by this conflict. But here we are instead with, as you say, the Parliament in standstill or getting there, something that you're going to cover in the interview segment. In that vein, I did just want to flag some interesting polling coming out of Ukraine at the moment, showing the complexity of the evolving mood amongst the public after 2 years of war. Only 45% of Ukrainians in this latest poll said they believe the war will end with Ukraine restoring its 1991 borders. This is coming from the Ukrainian media outlet NV, citing a poll conducted by the IRI. Now, crucially, 45%, some people would say, well, that doesn't sound very high, but that actually does represent a plurality. There is not any other answer that gets close to that. So tied for second place at 16% were two options. Ukraine would regain all of the territory it held up to the beginning of the full-scale war, so that excludes Crimea and parts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. And perhaps most interesting, the other answer, that Russia would gain some additional territories. So the 45% of respondents who believe that Ukraine would regain all of its territory represented a decrease from the high point in February 2023, in which 74% of respondents believed it was possible. That would have been riding high after the first counteroffensive. There's also a generational divide present in this poll, with younger people aged 18 to 35 less likely, 37%, to believe the 1991 borders will be restored, compared to those who are over the age of 50, of whom 52% believe it was possible. Despite the less than optimistic results, 39% of respondents said that the restoration of 1991 borders was the most important goal of the war. So just what do we read all into this? I think all the usual caveats have to apply whenever it comes to polling. I personally dislike them quite a lot, but it suggests that there is a large number of people who believe Kyiv can achieve its objectives of outright victory, but it has slipped substantially. Yet, and this is the important bit, I think, evidently people don't believe that Russia will make great advances either in Ukraine at the moment. So they believe the line is effectively frozen. They might well be right, with some analysts arguing that neither side has the strength, as you were saying earlier, this year to change the picture much. But it's a big assumption. And as I discussed yesterday, it's one that might well be suggestive of complacency if things do take a darker turn over the months and weeks ahead. So I think it's just a very interesting situation we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment. It does feel like we're at a bit of a crossroads, and it'll be something for us to monitor, I think, sensitively as we approach the warmer months, when inevitably there will be some manoeuvres in both the political and military realms.
Coming up, I interview Andrea Yanuta, reporter at the Kyiv Independent, on her article about how the Ukrainian Parliament is starting to drift to a standstill. Stay tuned. Andrea, thank you so much for your time. Your article describes the Ukrainian Parliament as sort of coming nearly to a standstill, moving towards a standstill. What's happening?
So Ukraine's parliament is called the Verkhovna Rada, and they're part of the legislative branch. So they debate and then they pass legislature, which goes to the president's desk for signing. What we're seeing in the last few months is that for some legislation, Parliament simply isn't able to find the number of votes it needs to pass laws. So to be clear, critically vital legislation is still passing with broad support. This would include things like the extension of martial law, which has to be voted on every 3 months, and bills that are needed in order to get closer to EU integration. It's more issues like domestic tax issues, for example, that are having the problems. There's just been a real slowdown in how much Parliament is actually able to accomplish right now. This is particularly surprising because the majority party in Parliament, Zelensky's Servant of the People Party, has enough votes entirely on its own to pass most legislation if people from the party just showed up and voted along their party lines. So when I spoke to lawmakers and experts, it's clear that the reason for this slowdown isn't what you might expect from a typical parliamentary issue. It's not that these parliamentarians are debating these laws and having disagreements and can't come to pass them. It's simply that they're dissatisfied, frustrated, they have low morale, and they don't want to show up. As an example, at the March 28th parliamentary session, there are 235 members of Zelensky's ruling party in parliament, and only 226 are needed to pass most legislation. But at the March 28th session, only 154 members of the faction were registered as present for the voting.
Can you go into some of the details then? Why is morale so low?
At the start of the war, there was a really clear united front. Everyone had to work together to pass a huge volume of new laws just to keep the country afloat and surviving. But now 2 years in, as one expert told me, politics has returned to the parliament. When I spoke with lawmakers, I kind of understood there's no one single bullet, there's no one reason. There's a couple things that are going on. One of them, and I heard this from a lot of people, was increased restrictions on their ability to travel abroad. Right now in Ukraine, all men of military age can't leave the country. But there's been additional law, except for some special exceptions. So there have been additional restrictions placed on government officials, including all lawmakers, regardless of gender, limiting their ability to travel outside of work. That's one factor. Another factor that I've heard from several people is poor communication or pressure from other government bodies, especially growing concentration of power in the president's office. To put it simply, lawmakers feel they're kind of being used as a tool, just expected to pass things without really having as much of their own input. And then another factor is being blamed for unpopular policies by both the Ukrainian public and other government officials. Many of them feel that it's unfair to be kind of the sole scapegoat for difficult legislation that might need to pass.
That's a fantastic overview. You mentioned there the concentration of power in the president's office. Could you tell us a little bit more about this? What's been the pattern over the past 2 years? Why is this happening?
I think it's pretty natural during a time of war that power would be concentrated. Decisions need to be made quickly and effectively, but over the past 2 years, I think other members of the government have started to push back a little bit and want more of a say in what's going on.
One of the analysts you interviewed described this slowdown as a sort of protest against how government's being done. Can you talk us through this? That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think I'm interpreted simply as a kind of standoff. Parliamentarians are saying, hey, you're not working with us. You're not coming to meetings with us. You're not even calling us up and asking, I know you're dissatisfied. What can I do to help? How can we resolve this issue? And their response to that is sort of, why should we help you? And also, me showing up and voting gives me all of the negative blame for these policies. I don't want to be hit with that. It's better to not show up and not vote than to show up and vote and take all the blame.
You've detailed what they think. What does the president's office think? What's their take on what's going on?
We, of course, reached out to the president's office to hear their take on things, and the position of the office is very clear. They believe during a full-scale war, all the representatives of all the branches, legislative, executive, judicial, all the officials, they need to be working together at 100%.
Let's go back to something you said earlier. You mentioned that one of the reasons for the discontent was this ban on international travel for MPs. I've heard that from Ukrainian MPs. They're telling me that sort of 6 months ago as well. Tell us more about that. Why is that such an issue for them?
So Ukrainian parliamentarians still are able to get permission to travel if it's for official business. But we've been hearing of cases where even official invitations from other governments, official travel to government events, to government sessions has been blocked. They haven't been granted permission. Some of the people I spoke to described this as just a case of the decision makers being too careful, while a number definitely attributed it to political influence. For example, one opposition lawmaker found that his travel was canceled after he voted against a law that the president's office had been championing. And when other lawmakers who voted against it were also blocked from travel, and some who voted for it were allowed to travel, he interpreted that as direct political retribution trying to influence his independence in his voting. We asked the president's office about these charges that they're influencing lawmakers' votes, and their response was that these charges do not correspond to reality, and they also noted that Parliament's leadership is ultimately responsible for the travel approval.
Putting this in context then, in Ukraine, there's quite low trust in Parliament at the moment. Can you talk about that? How do we get there? Why?
Yes. So there was a recent poll from the Kiev International Institute of Sociology that came out in December, and it showed that 15% of Ukrainians trust their parliament. This was the lowest for any body of the government that was in the poll. And this is also a big drop from the year before, where it was at 35%. So to be clear, this is still slightly higher than it was before 2022. We saw a big jump in trust in all the government institutions after the full-scale invasion. But there have been scandals. There have been members of parliament caught taking bribes, caught requesting bribes, the travel abroad. Part of the reason for the restrictions is there were members of parliament caught using those business trips to go on luxury vacations on their way back, which is something that ordinary Ukrainian men aren't able to do. So those are some of the scandals that have contributed to the falling trust. And to be clear, there have been other corruption scandals in other bodies of the government. It's not solely concentrated in parliament.
And just to start to sum this up then, what's the impact of the standoff, as you said, in the Ukrainian parliament?
For now, parliament is still functioning. It's not functioning at peak performance. There is a slowdown, but the things it desperately needs to do, it's able to get done. But the leaders of parliament are starting to pay attention and noticing that things are coming to a slowdown. It's getting harder for them to do their job. For example, David Arachamia, who leads the Servant of the People majority faction in parliament, directly acknowledged this in January, saying there was a looming crisis. We're not at a crisis yet, but if things get worse, it could definitely head that way. Another thing that Arachamia has brought up when he's talked about this potential crisis is not just lack of unity, but also there are fewer members of parliament than there were before the invasion. So by law, there should be 450 seats filled in parliament. Actually, after the last elections, which were in 2019, they were only able to fill 424 seats. That's because it's impossible to hold elections in Crimea, which has been illegally annexed by Russia, and the eastern territories that Russia was occupying at the time. Since then, the number has dropped even further. Right now, there are only 401 seats of parliament filled. There's a variety of reasons for this. Immediately after the full-scale invasion, some lawmakers were stripped of their right to be in parliament for pro-Russian activities. There have been members that have resigned. Some have been kicked out of parliament. Criminal cases, there have been scandals. Some members of parliament have been promoted to cabinet positions, and there's even a case where one died. So half the seats in parliament are elected off party lists. People aren't voting for individual people, they're voting for a party, and then the parties are given a proportional amount of seats to fill off their lists. If someone in one of these seats leaves parliament, the party can just backfill it from their list. But the other half of parliamentarians, they're directly voted on. And when a member who joins parliament this way leaves their seat, there have to be new elections. So when these members of parliament leave, the seats just empty until new elections. And as we know, elections right now are suspended under martial law. First off, it would be a major security risk to hold elections. And secondly, there's just a huge logistical question of how do you hold elections with such a huge displaced population? You have the people fighting on the front lines. You have areas of people under occupation. It would just be very, very, very difficult to hold elections that could be seen as legitimate.
How are people trying to solve this then? Did you get a sense that there's stuff being done, the future might look better?
Everyone I spoke to said that there needs to be more communication with different bodies of government and the members of parliament. There needs to be more cooperation. We're seeing a little bit of that. There have been some recent meetings in the past couple months, cabinet members, the president, but from sources who were either at those meetings or spoke to people right afterwards, they didn't seem to be having the intended effect. I think a lot of members of parliament walked out of those meetings still feeling like they weren't being heard, they weren't being listened to, they weren't being worked with. So as far as I know, there hasn't been any huge progress yet, but it does seem like the executive branch and the other areas of government are waking up to the fact that something needs to change if things will continue functioning smoothly.
Andrew, thank you so much for your time. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.